A man can have 2 wives, 2 houses, 2 lives, and for years nobody bats an eye, until the day both worlds collide on the same front porch. What you are about to hear is not a movie. It is not fiction. It is not something that happened in another country, in another era, or to people who were careless or foolish. This happened in the suburbs of the United States, in a neighborhood with good schools and clean sidewalks and neighbors who waved from their driveways. It happened to 2 women who did everything right. And it happened because one man was willing to look the people he loved most directly in the eyes and lie every single day for 6 years. What you are about to discover will make you question how well you truly know the person sleeping next to you tonight. So stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes, and the ending will leave you thinking about it for days. Her name was Linda, and on a random Tuesday morning, she rang a doorbell she had never touched before, and everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and the man she loved began to fall apart. What would you do if a complete stranger showed up at your door and told you she was married to your husband too? That is not a hypothetical. That is not a thought experiment. That is exactly what happened on a quiet residential street in the American Midwest on a Tuesday morning in the spring. 2 women, 1 doorbell, 1 man, and a secret so carefully constructed, so meticulously maintained, that it held together for nearly 6 full years before a single question asked by a 7-year-old child brought the entire thing crashing down. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to the beginning, because to understand how this story ends, you need to understand exactly how it started. There is a man at the center of this story. His name is Marcus. And on paper, on every single piece of paper that mattered, Marcus was exactly the kind of man you would want living next door to you. He was a regional sales manager for a mid-sized logistics company based out of Columbus, Ohio. He drove a clean, reliable SUV. He paid his bills on time. He coached his son's Little League team on Saturday mornings. His coworkers described him as dependable. His neighbors described him as friendly. His family described him as devoted. And every single one of them was telling the truth, which is precisely what makes this story so deeply unsettling. Because Marcus was also, simultaneously, something else entirely. He was a man running 2 complete lives, 2 wives, 2 households, 2 sets of children who called him daddy, 2 anniversary dinners booked at different restaurants, in different cities every single year. And for nearly 6 years he kept every piece of it perfectly separated. Not almost perfectly, not mostly, perfectly. Until a Tuesday morning in spring, when a woman named Linda drove 40 miles, parked across the street from a house she had never seen before, walked up to a front door she had never touched, and rang the bell. To understand Sarah, you have to understand what she was building. Sarah grew up in a small town in central Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and your parents' names, and probably your grandparents' names too. She was the first person in her family to graduate from a 4-year university. She put herself through college working 2 jobs, one at the campus library and one waitressing on weekends. She studied business administration. She was practical, organized, and deeply loyal to the people she loved. She was not the kind of woman who made impulsive decisions. She was not the kind of woman who ignored red flags. She was, by every account from the people who knew her best, exactly the kind of woman who had her eyes open. And that is the part of this story that matters most. Because if a woman like Sarah could be deceived this completely for this long, by someone she lived with and loved and built a life with, then it forces you to ask a question that is genuinely uncomfortable. Could it happen to anyone? Sarah met Marcus at a college football tailgate in the fall of 2011. She was 23 years old. He was 26. He was funny and confident and warm in the way that makes you feel like you are the most interesting person in the room. They dated for 2 years, and in that time, Sarah told her closest friends that Marcus was the most consistent person she had ever been with. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He remembered things, small things, the kind of things that tell you someone is actually paying attention. He remembered how she took her coffee. He remembered the name of the teacher who had been hardest on her in high school. He remembered the anniversary of her grandmother's passing and always acknowledged it quietly, without making a production of it. He was, in every visible way, exactly what he appeared to be. They got engaged in the summer of 2013. Marcus proposed at the Grand Canyon during a trip they had been planning for almost a year. Sarah still has the photograph from that evening on her phone. They married 3 months later in front of 180 people in a barn. venue outside of Columbus that Sarah had fallen in love with the first time she drove past it. By 2015, they had a son named Jake. By 2016, they had bought a house in a suburb called Westerville. A 4-bedroom house with a 2-car garage and a backyard big enough for a trampoline and a vegetable garden that Sarah planted herself every spring. To everyone who knew them, they were the picture of a young American family, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Sarah worked part-time as an office manager for a dental practice 3 days a week. Marcus traveled for work, which he had done since before they were married, and which had always been a normal, unremarkable part of their life together. He was gone sometimes Monday through Wednesday, sometimes longer if a deal was closing. The travel was consistent enough that Sarah had built her entire weekly rhythm around it. She handled school drop-offs, managed the household, kept everything running, and Marcus always came home. He always called from the road. He always brought Jake something back from wherever he had been. That was the life Sarah knew. That was the life Sarah believed in, and every single piece of it was real. That is the cruelest part of what Marcus did. The life he built with Sarah was genuine. He did love her. He did love Jake, and he did it anyway. Now you need to understand Linda, because Linda is not a footnote in this story. Linda is not the other woman in the way that phrase usually implies, the one who knew, the one who chose to look away, the one complicit in the deception. Linda was deceived just as completely, just as deliberately, and just as cruelly as Sarah was. Linda grew up outside of Cincinnati. She was the daughter of a retired Army officer and a high school math teacher, and she inherited something from each of them. From her father, a discipline and a directness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and from her mother, a patience and a precision with numbers and systems that made her exceptionally good at her job. Linda had a master's degree in marketing from the University of Cincinnati. By the time she was 31, she was a marketing director for a mid-sized healthcare company, managing a team of 11 people and a budget that ran into the millions. She was not a woman who missed details. She was not a woman who accepted things at face value without thinking them through. She was, professionally and personally, someone who trusted data over feelings and evidence over assumption. And Marcus knew that, which is why what he built for Linda was specifically designed to hold up under exactly that kind of scrutiny. He did not just lie to Linda the way a careless man lies. He constructed a version of himself that was internally consistent, logically sound, and emotionally compelling, a version that gave Linda nothing to pull on, nothing to examine too closely, nothing that did not add up. For 3 years it worked perfectly. Marcus met Linda at an industry conference in Indianapolis in the spring of 2016. He was 3 years into his marriage with Sarah. Jake was just over a year old, and Marcus, by all appearances, was a happily married man with a young child at home, none of which he disclosed to Linda because that is not how this worked. What he told Linda was that he had been in a long-term relationship that had ended badly about a year prior, that he had thrown himself into work since then, and that he had not met anyone who made him want to change that, until her. Linda has said in the time since that she did not fall for Marcus immediately. She was cautious, she was busy, she was not looking for a relationship. But he was persistent in the right way, not overwhelming, not intense, just steady. He texted her after the conference. He remembered things she had mentioned in conversation. He suggested a dinner the next time he was going to be in Cincinnati for work, which happened to be 3 weeks later, and that dinner led to another, and by the fall of 2016, they were in what both of them described as a committed relationship. He told her early on that his job required significant travel. He told her he had considered relocating, but that the company needed him mobile for the foreseeable future. He told her that he knew it was not ideal, but that he wanted to make it work if she did, and Linda said yes, because everything he showed her was consistent. Because he always showed up exactly when he said he would. Because the version of Marcus that Linda was falling in love with was real enough that nothing about it required her to be suspicious. They were long distance for 8 months. Marcus drove between Columbus and Cincinnati on his designated weeks with Linda, which he had organized into a schedule so precise that he never once missed a commitment to either woman during that period. Thursday evenings through Sunday afternoons belonged to Linda. Monday through Wednesday evenings belonged to Sarah. And when a holiday or a birthday or an anniversary fell on the wrong side of the schedule, Marcus managed it with a level of logistical creativity that, in a different context, would have been genuinely impressive. He moved dinners. He rescheduled trips. He always had a client emergency or a deal that needed to close or a flight that got rerouted. and both women accepted these explanations because they fit the established pattern of who Marcus was. A man whose job made consistent demands on his time and who always came through in the end. He proposed to Linda in December of 2017 at a restaurant in Cincinnati she had mentioned once, almost in passing, as a place she had always wanted to try. He had made the reservation months in advance. He had called ahead. He had, in the words of the woman who seated them that evening, clearly planned this down to the last detail. They married in April of 2018. Small ceremony. 40 guests. A venue outside Cincinnati that Linda had found herself. By then, Marcus and Sarah's son Jake was 3 years old, and Sarah was 5 months pregnant with their second child. Marcus attended Sarah's 20-week ultrasound on a Wednesday. He drove to Cincinnati on Thursday for a rehearsal dinner with Linda's family. He sat across from Linda's parents and her brother and her closest friends, and he was warm and funny and completely at ease. Because he had been doing this for years, and he was very, very good at it. Before we go any further, let us pause here. Because if you are listening to this and you are feeling something uncomfortable, a kind of slow, building dread, that is the correct response. Because what Marcus was doing was not the act of a man who had stumbled into something complicated. This was architecture. This was deliberate, calculated, ongoing construction. Every week for years he was making hundreds of active choices. Choices to lie, choices to maintain. Choices to show up and be present and loving and completely convincing in two completely separate lives. And both women were building their futures on a foundation that only one of them knew was hollow. There were signs. There are always signs. In retrospect, Marcus's phone was always face down on the table. He never answered calls in front of either woman. He always excused himself, always stepped outside, always had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready when he came back in. He was absent for both families on every major holiday, rotating the excuse between them. One year it was a client crisis for Sarah on Thanksgiving, a family obligation for Linda. The next year, the explanations flipped. He kept a second email address that neither woman knew about. He had 2 separate Apple IDs. He had 2 phones for a period of about 18 months until managing them became more risk than it was worth, and he consolidated back to one, using a complicated system of contact labels and notification filters that he had apparently developed and tested. Himself, he paid for Linda's life out of a bank account that Sarah did not know existed, funded by a portion of his commission income that he had always described to Sarah as being set aside for retirement. He told Linda the same thing about the savings he kept from her. He was, in the most literal sense, stealing from both women to fund the deception that was destroying both of them. And for 6 years, neither woman had a single concrete reason to question any of it. It started with a homework assignment. In the spring of 2023, Linda's daughter, a 7-year-old girl named Chloe, bright and curious and utterly unaware of the role she was about to play in unraveling her father's entire constructed world, came home from second grade with a family tree worksheet. It was a standard assignment, the kind that teachers have given to second graders for decades. Draw your family. Label the branches. Bring it in tomorrow. Chloe sat down at the kitchen table with her crayons and her worksheet and began to fill it in the way any 7-year-old would, starting with herself, then her parents, then working outward. And at some point during that process, she looked up at her father and asked him a question that Marcus was not prepared for. She asked him if he had a brother. Marcus asked her why she was asking, and Chloe said, in the direct and uncomplicated way that only small children can manage, that she had seen a name in his phone, a kid's name, a name she did not recognize. She had been playing a game on his phone earlier that week when a notification had come through, and she had seen it before he could take the phone back. The name was Jake, and Chloe wanted to know who Jake was. Marcus told her Jake was a coworker's son. He told her it was nothing. He told her to finish her homework. But Linda was in the kitchen, and Linda heard the question. And Linda, who had built her career on the ability to notice when something did not add up, felt something shift inside her that she could not immediately name. She did not say anything to Marcus that evening. She finished dinner. She helped Chloe with her homework. She went through the rest of the night with a careful, practiced calm, and when Marcus fell asleep, she picked up her own phone and started to think. Linda is not someone who acts on feelings. She is someone who acts on information. So she did not immediately confront Marcus with a question she did not yet have the evidence to support. Instead, she started gathering data, quietly, methodically, without tipping her hand. She started with the mileage on their shared vehicle, the one Marcus used when he drove in from out of town, which he did every Thursday evening. She had a rough sense of how many miles a round trip between Cincinnati and Columbus should add. The numbers did not match. Not by a little, by a lot. She pulled up their shared credit card statements going back 18 months and cross-referenced every hotel charge against public conference calendars for the cities Marcus had claimed to be visiting. She found 7 charges for hotels in cities where no relevant industry event had taken place on the dates Marcus had been allegedly attending them. She found a restaurant charge in Phoenix on a night Marcus had told her he was in Atlanta. She found a recurring charge to a grocery delivery service in a zip code she did not recognize, one that was not in Columbus, where Marcus's company was headquartered, and not in Cincinnati, where they lived. She pulled up the zip code. It was a suburb called Westerville. She had never heard Marcus mention Westerville. She searched the zip code and Marcus's name together. Nothing came up. She searched the grocery delivery service address. It came back to a residential street. She wrote the address down on a notepad, tore the page off, and put it in her purse. She did all of this over the course of about 4 days, working in the evenings after Chloe was in bed, on her personal laptop in the bedroom with the door closed. Marcus noticed nothing, or if he did, he gave no indication, because Marcus had spent 6 years training himself not to react to things that made him nervous. And he was very, very good at it. The marriage certificate was not something Linda was looking for. She found it because she was doing something entirely mundane, reorganizing the home office closet to make room for a filing cabinet she had ordered. Marcus kept his personal documents in that closet, in a series of accordion folders on the back shelf, behind a box of old tax returns and a collection of instruction manuals for appliances they no longer owned. Linda had been through those folders before years ago, when they were filing jointly for the first time and needed to compile documents. She knew roughly what was in them. She was not expecting to find anything. She pulled the stack off the shelf to move it out of the way, while she rearranged the space, and when she set it on the floor, one of the folders slipped from the middle of the stack and fell open. A manila envelope slid partway out. It was heavier than it should have been for an envelope, and it had a rubber band around it that had dried out and snapped. Linda picked it up. The envelope was not labeled. That alone was unusual. Marcus was obsessively organized about labeling everything. She opened it. Inside was a collection of documents. A lease agreement for a property in Westerville, Ohio, the same zip code she had written on the notepad in her purse. A set of utility bills in Marcus's name at a Westerville address. And underneath those at the bottom of the stack, a marriage certificate, issued by the state of Ohio. Dated September 14, 2013, Marcus's name. And another name. A woman's name, Sarah. Linda has described what happened in the next several minutes in a way that is almost clinical in its precision, because that is how Linda processes things. She said she sat down on the floor of the closet. She said she read the document 3 times from beginning to end. She said she checked the date 4 times. She said she did not cry. She said she did not feel panic or rage or grief, not yet. Those came later, in waves, over the weeks that followed. What she felt in that moment, she said, was something closer to clarity. A terrible, devastating clarity. Everything she had been collecting for the past 4 days suddenly had a shape, and the shape of it was a name. Sarah. Linda spent the next 2 days doing nothing outwardly different from what she always did. She went to work. She picked Chloe up from school. She made dinner. She responded to Marcus's texts with the same warmth and brevity she always used. She gave him absolutely no indication that anything had changed. And in the evenings, after Chloe was asleep, she continued her research. She now had an address in Westerville. She searched it against public property records and found that the house was owned jointly by Marcus and a woman named Sarah. She found Sarah's name attached to a business profile for a dental practice in Westerville, where Sarah worked as an office manager. She found a photograph, a professional headshot from the practice's website, a woman in her early 30s with a steady, open expression. She found a Facebook profile, set to mostly private, but with a profile photo that showed Sarah and a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. A boy who looked, Linda said later, unmistakably like Marcus. She stared at that photograph for a long time. She closed her laptop. She sat in the dark of her home office, in the house she shared with the man who had built all of this, and she made a decision. She was not going to call the police. She was not going to call an attorney. She was not going to confront Marcus. Not yet, not over the phone. Not in the house they shared with their daughter. She was going to go to Westerville. She was going to knock on that door. She was going to look Sarah in the eye and tell her the truth. 'Cause if the situation were reversed, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly reversed, Linda would want someone to knock on her door. She drove on a Tuesday morning. She dropped Chloe at school, came home, sat in her car in the driveway for 22 minutes. She has said she was not changing her mind in those 22 minutes. She was steadying herself. There is a difference. She drove north on I-71 toward Columbus, then took the 270 bypass east toward Westerville. 40 miles. About 45 minutes in morning traffic. Long enough, she said, to think about what she was going to say, and to realize that nothing she prepared in her head was going to survive contact with the actual moment. She pulled onto Sarah's street at 9:04 in the morning. She parked on the opposite side of the road, about 3 houses down. She could see the house clearly from where she was. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, a basketball hoop at the end of the driveway, a vegetable garden along the side of the house that was just starting to show the first growth of spring. A family's house. A real family's house. She sat there for 10 minutes. She thought about turning around. She has said she will not pretend that thought did not cross her mind, because it did, more than once in those 10 minutes. But she kept coming back to the same thing, that somewhere behind that door was a woman living, the same lie she had been living, and that woman deserved to know. So she got out of the car, walked up the front path, and rang the bell. And what happened next is the part of this story that nobody who hears it ever forgets. Sarah answered the door at 9:14 in the morning, expecting, she has said, a package from Amazon. She was in her work clothes, her keys in one hand, about to leave for her shift at the dental practice. She opened the door and found a woman she had never seen before standing on her front porch. A woman who was visibly nervous, but holding herself together with the kind of controlled composure that comes from having made a very deliberate decision. Sarah has described that first moment in a way that suggests her instincts understood something before her conscious mind caught up. She said she knew before a single word was spoken that something serious was happening. Not a solicitor, not a neighbor, something else. Something that was going to change the shape of her morning. And possibly the shape of everything after it. Linda introduced herself by her first name. She said she was sorry to arrive unannounced. She said she knew this was going to be difficult to hear. And then she said the sentence that Sarah has never been able to forget. The sentence that she has described as feeling simultaneously impossible and completely inevitable the moment it was spoken aloud. Linda said, "I think I am married to your husband." Sarah did not slam the door. She did not scream. She did not reach for her phone to call Marcus. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Sarah has said it felt like a very long moment but was probably only a few seconds. And then she did. Something that surprised Linda completely. Something that surprised Sarah herself when she thought about it later. She stepped back from the door. She opened it wider, and she said, "Come inside. I just made coffee." This is the moment in the story where most people pause, because it is not the response anyone anticipates. When you imagine how a woman reacts to finding out that a stranger on her doorstep claims to be married to her husband, you do not imagine coffee. You do not imagine a calm invitation into the house. You imagine an explosion. You imagine tears or fury or disbelief so complete that speech becomes impossible. Sarah has explained her reaction in the time since, and her explanation is worth sitting with. She has said that the reason she did not scream, the reason she did not slam the door, was not that she did not feel those things. She felt all of them, she has said, cycling through her chest like something electrical. The reason she opened the door wider was that she looked at Linda's face and understood immediately that this was not a woman who had come to her door to cause harm. This was a woman who had come to tell her something true, and Sarah, who had spent years working in a professional environment that required her to stay calm in situations that warranted panic, made a choice in that doorway that she has described as the most important choice she has ever made. She chose to listen, and so the two of them sat down at Sarah's kitchen table, the table where Sarah made school lunches and paid bills and sat with Jake while he did his homework, and for the next 3 hours, they talked. Before we go deeper into what happened at that kitchen table, there is something you need to understand about the way this story traveled once it became known. Because when pieces of it began to circulate online, initially through a series of posts on a parenting forum, then picked up by a true crime discussion community on Reddit, then filtered through social media in the fragmented, context-stripped way that social media handles everything, a theory emerged. The theory was this, that Sarah had known that this was not a genuine confrontation between two deceived women, but some kind of coordinated action. That Sarah and Linda had somehow connected before Linda showed up at the door. That the whole thing was staged, either as a setup against Marcus or, in the more elaborate versions of the theory, as some kind of content play, a manufactured drama designed to go viral. This theory spread far enough and fast enough that both women became aware of it. And it is worth addressing directly, because it says something important. Not just about this story, but about the way we process stories about women being deceived. The impulse to disbelieve Sarah, to insert agency and complicity where there was none, reflects a very specific kind of skepticism that tends to get applied when the victims of deception are women. Sarah's bank records, reviewed as part of the subsequent legal proceedings, showed clearly that she had no knowledge of Linda's existence, no access to the account Marcus used to fund the second household, and no record of any contact with Linda prior to the morning Linda appeared on her doorstep. Her text message history, which was submitted as evidence, included a message to her sister sent the week before Linda's visit in which Sarah mentioned that Marcus had seemed slightly distracted lately. Not suspicious, just distracted, and her sister had responded by suggesting he was probably stressed about work. That was the extent of Sarah's awareness. She did not know, and the record is very clear on that point. What happened at that kitchen table over those 3 hours is something that both women have described in consistent corroborating detail, which is itself a form of evidence. They pulled out calendars, Sarah's paper wall calendar from the kitchen and Linda's digital calendar on her phone, and they began to map Marcus's movements against each other. Every business trip, every conference, every client emergency, every time he had been unavailable. They laid it all out, side by side, and what emerged was a schedule so precise and so deliberately constructed that both women, looking at it together for the first time, fell silent for a long moment before either one of them spoke. Marcus had been running a rotation, Mondays through Wednesdays with Sarah, Thursdays through Sundays with Linda. Every week for years, with occasional adjustments for holidays and school events and travel logistics, managed and maintained with the consistency of someone who had built it as a system and treated it as a system. They matched his excuses against each other. The work trips that had sent him away from Sarah matched exactly to the weeks he had been present with Linda. The conferences that had kept him from Linda matched to the weekends he had been home with Sarah and Jake. Every explanation had a mirror image on the other side. Every absence was an alibi. The gift he had brought Sarah from a supposed conference in Nashville was purchased, Linda confirmed, at a shop in Cincinnati that she herself had once pointed out to him on a walk. He had filed it away and used it at the appropriate moment. He had thought of everything. And sitting at that kitchen table comparing notes across 6 years of meticulously maintained deception, both women arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. This was not a man who had gotten in over his head. This was a man who had chosen this. Deliberately, repeatedly, every single day. At 12:47 in the afternoon, Sarah picked up her phone and called Marcus. She put the call on speaker. Linda was sitting across the table from her. Marcus answered on the second ring. He almost always answered quickly, which Sarah had always taken as a sign of attentiveness, and which now carried a different meaning entirely. Sarah's voice was calm. She has said that the calm was not something she had to manufacture. It arrived naturally, the way calm sometimes does, when you have moved through the worst of the shock, and come out the other side into something colder and clearer. She asked him one question. She said, "Where are you right now?" Marcus said he was at the office. He said it easily and immediately, the way a man answers a question he has answered 1,000 times. And then Sarah said, "I have someone here who would like to say hello." There was a silence. Linda has said she counted it afterward by the seconds, the way you count the gap between lightning and thunder to estimate distance. The silence lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which Marcus said absolutely nothing, in which no sound came from his end of the line except the faint ambient noise of wherever he actually was. 11 seconds that told both women everything they needed to know, not about what Marcus had done, they already knew that, but about who Marcus was. A man who could not find a single word to say in the 11 seconds after his 2 wives were in the same room. Marcus drove to Linda's house that evening, not Sarah's, Linda's. He walked in at 6:53. Linda noted the time, and the first thing he did was attempt to begin a sentence that Linda has described, with a remarkable absence of emotion, as one of the most inadequate attempts at an explanation she has ever witnessed. He did not get far. Linda had spent the afternoon on the phone with an attorney. Sarah had done the same. Both women had been advised to document everything, to make no financial moves until they had spoken with counsels, and to say nothing to Marcus that might complicate the legal proceedings that were, by that point, inevitable. Linda told Marcus that she knew everything. She told him that Sarah knew everything. She told him that both of them had spoken with attorneys, and she told him that she would need him to leave the house that evening and to not return without prior arrangement through the attorneys. Marcus left. He has not spoken publicly about any of this in the time since. His attorney did most of his talking for him, and what his attorney said in court was, by the assessment of both judges involved in the subsequent proceedings, largely ineffective. The argument that Marcus's defense mounted rested on a psychological concept called compartmentalization, the idea that Marcus had developed an extreme form of the psychological tendency to keep different areas of one's life mentally separate, and that this condition had, in some meaningful clinical sense, impaired his judgment or his awareness of the harm he was causing. Both judges were unpersuaded. The judge in Sarah's proceeding noted in her ruling that the degree of planning and logistical sophistication evident in Marcus's conduct over 6 years was consistent not with impaired judgment, but with deliberate, sustained choice. The legal consequences that followed were significant. Bigamy is a felony under Ohio law, and Marcus was charged accordingly. He faced proceedings in 2 separate domestic relations courts simultaneously, a situation that his attorneys found professionally unprecedented, and that the family law community in central Ohio discussed for months afterward. His employer placed him on administrative leave within 2 weeks of the story becoming public. Both Sarah and Linda filed for divorce. Both sought primary physical custody of their respective children, and both, ultimately, were granted it. The sentencing came 14 months after the initial charges were filed. Marcus received 18 months, with the possibility of release after 12 served. He was also ordered to pay restitution, a figure that attempted to account for the financial resources he had diverted from both households to maintain the deception. He served 11 months. He was released in early spring. He relocated to another state. According to accounts that emerged through mutual social connections in the months after his release, he was dating again within approximately 6 months of getting out. This last detail is the one that both Sarah and Linda have said is the hardest to sit with, not because it is surprising. They had both by that point developed a clear-eyed understanding of who Marcus was, but because of what it implies, that a man who built this level of deception, who maintained it for this long, who caused this much harm to this many people, walked away from the consequences of all of it in under a year, and returned, apparently, to the same patterns with the same apparent ease. There is no satisfying answer to what that says about the limits of consequence. There is only the fact of it. Here is the part of this story that nobody in the court system, nobody in the online communities that followed the case, and nobody in the legal and journalistic circles that covered it expected. Sarah and Linda became friends, not immediately, not in the clean, cinematic way that a simpler version of this story might suggest. It took months. It took awkwardness and grief, and the particular difficulty of building a relationship with another person, when the entire foundation of that relationship is a shared wound. But it happened. Linda called Sarah 3 weeks after the initial confrontation to ask how she was doing. Not to compare notes on the legal proceedings, not to strategize, just to ask. Sarah has said that phone call was the one that made her understand what kind of person Linda was. And Sarah called Linda back 6 weeks after that, on a night when Jake had asked a question about his father that Sarah did not know how to answer, and Linda, who was dealing with an almost identical conversation with Chloe, talked with her for 2 hours. They began meeting occasionally for coffee when the logistics of their respective lives allowed it. They began sharing information about the children's adjustment, because it turned out that Jake and Chloe, who were half-siblings in the most complicated possible sense of that word, were both asking versions of the same questions, and that having 2 adults working from the same framework of honesty made those conversations slightly more manageable for everyone. They did not forgive Marcus. Neither of them has said that, and neither of them, in any account of this story, has expressed any interest in arriving at that destination. What they have said, both of them, separately and together, is that they refuse to allow Marcus to be the one who determined the shape of their lives going forward. He had already taken 6 years. They were not going to give him the rest. Sarah made a statement at some point in the year following the legal proceedings, in a context that was not originally intended for wide distribution, but that was eventually quoted in a piece about the case. She said this: "He thought he was the architect of 2 lives. But the only thing he actually built was the moment 2 strangers became sisters." It is worth sitting with that sentence for a moment. Because what Sarah is describing is not a silver lining. She is not saying that something good came from something terrible, and that therefore the terrible thing was worth it or redeemable in any way. She is saying something more precise than that. She is saying that Marcus's plan, the elaborate, meticulous, years-long plan to maintain two separate lives, contained within it, without his knowledge and against his intentions, the exact mechanism of its own undoing. He needed both women to be trusting. He needed both women to be competent and capable, and to manage their lives and their households without asking too many questions. He selected for exactly the qualities in both of them that, when finally brought into contact with each other, made them formidable. He built two strong women and then was surprised when they were strong. And in the end, the only lasting thing he constructed was a friendship between two people who, under any other circumstances, would never have met. Marcus served 11 months. He is living in another state. He is, as far as anyone knows, fine. And Sarah and Linda are also fine. Not in spite of what happened, but in the complicated, hard-won way that people are fine after something genuinely terrible, when they have done the work and built something real on the other side of it. Jake is in middle school now. Chloe is in 4th grade. They have met each other. It is early, and it is careful, and nobody is pretending it is simple. But they have met each other, which is more than anyone would have predicted on the morning. Linda drove 40 miles and rang a doorbell. So here's the question this story leaves you with. And it is not a rhetorical question, it is a genuine one. The kind that does not have a clean answer, but that is worth sitting with anyway. We live in a time of digital footprints and location services, and background check websites and social media profiles, searchable by anyone with a few minutes and a name. Marcus ran this operation for 6 years before a 7-year-old girl's asking about a name on a phone brought the whole thing down. Not an algorithm, not a background check, not a suspicious friend or a careless slip or a piece of mail arriving at the wrong address. A child with a homework assignment. So what does that tell you about the limits of the systems we trust to protect us? What does it tell you about how much of our safety rests not on infrastructure, but on the willingness of the person across from us to choose honesty? And here's the question I want you to actually think about and answer honestly. Not for me, but for yourself. Would you have spotted the signs? I want to know what you think. At what moment in this story did everything start to crack open for you? Was it the daughter's question about the name on the phone? Was it the mileage that did not add up? Was it the marriage certificate at the bottom of that stack in the closet? Or had you already felt something was wrong before any of those things happened? Drop it in the comments and tell me which detail was the one that did it for you. I read every single comment, and the conversation that happens in the comments on stories like this one is always worth being part of. And if you think this story was difficult to sit with, next week, I am covering a case where the secret did not come out for 22 years. And when it finally did, it did not come from a document in a closet or a name on a phone. It came from a DNA test. A kit that someone sent in just to find out about their ancestry. And what came back changed everything for everyone involved. If you are new here, I cover real stories like this one every week. Stories about deception and survival, and what happens when the truth finally catches up to the people who have been running from it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what is coming.